Grant Wilson was once the face of Ghost Hunters, a man who turned chasing shadows into primetime entertainment. But behind the cameras and eerie investigations, his story didn't end the way fans imagined. The rise to fame was fast, the fall was quiet, and what's left today is far darker than the glow of night vision ever revealed. What really happened after the downfall of the show? And why is his life in 2025 seen by many as tragic? Stay with us, because the disturbing truth about Grant Wilson is far more haunting than any ghost he ever claimed to find. Don't forget to subscribe, you won't want to miss this. When Ghost Hunters premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel in 2004, the world of paranormal television changed forever. Before then, ghost shows were often seen as cheap filler, with grainy reenactments, B-movie dramatizations, and shaky credibility. Grant Wilson, along with Jason Hawes, co-founded the Atlantic Paranormal Society, better known as TAPS. These two plumbers by trade stepped into the spotlight not as actors, but as so-called ordinary men fascinated with extraordinary things. And the audience connected instantly. Viewers weren't watching celebrities pretending to be scared. They were watching regular people step into dark, abandoned asylums, prisons, and haunted homes with nothing but night vision cameras, digital recorders, and their raw reactions. Wilson quickly became the emotional center of the show. While Hawes was seen as the no-nonsense, skeptical leader, Grant was more empathetic, approachable, and often the first to admit when something frightened him. His presence gave ghost hunters a sense of humanity, someone who balanced skepticism with belief, someone who wanted to help families tormented by strange experiences in their homes. He wasn't just chasing ghosts for entertainment. He was portrayed as offering comfort to people who felt they were living in fear. This distinction separated Ghost Hunters from other paranormal shows of its time and launched it into mainstream success. The show didn't just get popular, it became a cultural phenomenon. At its peak, Ghost Hunters drew in millions of viewers per episode, making it the Sci-Fi Channel's flagship program. Fans lined up at conventions to meet Grant, eager to shake his hand or share their own supernatural encounters. He wasn't a movie star, but in the paranormal world, he was bigger than one. Books, live Halloween specials, and international investigations followed. Suddenly, the plumber from Rhode Island was a household name, traveling the country in search of proof that life after death was real. But with fame came a heavy price. Grant's rise was meteoric, but it also bound him to a persona he could never easily step away from. For nearly a decade, his face and name were synonymous with the paranormal. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was his entire identity. And once that identity is locked into place, it becomes almost impossible to escape. Fans saw him as the believer, the emotional heartbeat of ghost hunters, and critics saw him as an easy target for mockery, questioning his credibility and the authenticity of the evidence presented. The foundation of his fame was solid, but the cracks were already forming beneath the surface. The bigger the empire got, the harder it would eventually fall. As Ghost Hunters pushed forward season after season, the cracks began to widen. Behind the smiling fan photos and dramatic cliffhangers, the reality of filming took a toll on Grant Wilson and the rest of the crew. The schedule was relentless. Constant travel across the country, weeks spent in abandoned buildings, and long nights filming until dawn. It wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting. The strain began to show. Fans noticed tension between Grant and Jason Hawes. While both publicly claimed to be close friends and co-leaders of TAPS, insiders whispered about creative clashes. Jason often leaned into the skeptical, dismissive approach, while Grant's on-screen role as the believer put them at odds. Over time, that dynamic became less of a balance and more of a rift. Was the show still about finding the truth, or was it about putting on a performance that kept ratings high? That question seemed to hang over every investigation. Criticism from skeptics also grew louder. Online forums dissected every episode, accusing the team of faking evidence, staging moments, or misleading audiences. Whether or not the accusations were true, the pressure mounted. Grant bore the brunt of this skepticism since he was often the one most visibly affected by supposed paranormal activity. Some critics argued he was too willing to accept evidence without enough scrutiny, while fans began to question whether he was being manipulated by producers producers to react a certain way. His reputation as the believer of the group made him both beloved and vulnerable. Meanwhile, the grueling schedule took him away from his family. Grant had a wife, Rihanna, and 3 children, but the life of constant filming meant he missed milestones, birthdays, and the stability of home. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was trying to help other families who believed they were haunted, all while his own family life grew more distant with every season. The emotional weight of that contradiction ate at him, and by season 8, it was clear that something had to give. The pressure behind the scenes reached a point where continuing became nearly impossible. Grant's energy seemed drained, his passion fading, and his smile on screen began to feel like a mask. The strain wasn't just physical, it was psychological. When a person is pushed to play the same role over and over, with millions watching and critics tearing every move apart, the joy eventually dies. For Grant Wilson, the once exciting world of paranormal investigations had turned into a cage. He was trapped by his own success, and the only way out would be to step away from the very empire he helped build. By 2012, after 8 seasons on the Sci-Fi Channel, Grant Wilson shocked fans with an announcement that no one saw coming. He was leaving Ghost Hunters. At first, the explanation seemed simple. He wanted to spend more time with his family and pursue other creative passions. The official farewell was staged gently, with emotional goodbyes from the team, somber music, and gratitude for his years on the show. To the casual viewer, it was the end of a long chapter, a man stepping down gracefully from a successful career. But for those who looked closer, the departure raised more questions than answers. Why would the co-founder of TAPS, the very man who helped build the empire, suddenly walk away at the height of the show's power? Ratings were still strong, fan conventions were drawing crowds, and the Sci-Fi Channel was still heavily marketing the series. The public story of spending more time with family didn't quite satisfy devoted fans. Whispers spread about conflicts behind the scenes, creative disagreements with Jason Hawes, disputes with producers over the direction of the show, and the possibility that Grant had grown tired of being locked into the role of believer. His on-screen persona, the empathetic heart of the investigations, had begun to weigh on him like a costume he could never take off. Then there were the skeptics, who believed his departure was linked to the mounting criticism of the show's authenticity. Internet communities were ruthless in their dissections of every episode, pointing out inconsistencies, supposed staged moments, and unexplained edits. Grant, as the one most visibly affected by paranormal evidence, bore the brunt of these accusations. For a man who wanted to be taken seriously as an investigator, the constant ridicule was crushing. Leaving the show may have been less about family time and more about escaping a cage of public doubt and personal exhaustion. The departure created a ripple effect. Ghost Hunters carried on without him, but the chemistry was never quite the same. Jason Hawes remained, but fans openly admitted that something felt off. The believer-skeptic balance had been broken. Ratings slipped, and though the show limped along for a few more seasons, the absence of Grant Wilson was a shadow that hung over every investigation. His quiet exit wasn't just the end of a role, it was the start of a haunting silence, one that would follow him for years. For Grant, stepping away might have seemed like a chance to breathe, to rediscover himself outside the world of ghost hunting. But in reality, leaving the Sci-Fi Channel also meant walking away from the identity he had built over nearly a decade. To fans, he wasn't just Grant Wilson. He was the Grant Wilson, co-founder of TAPS, the man who spoke softly to terrified homeowners and claimed to hear whispers in the dark. And no matter what he pursued after, that was the only version of himself that the public wanted. After leaving Ghost Hunters, Grant Wilson faced the monumental task of reinvention. He had built a career and a reputation around one thing: the paranormal. Now, away from the cameras of the Sci-Fi Channel, he tried to redirect his energy into other passions. He pursued his love of music, releasing albums and sharing original songs that showed a more personal, vulnerable side. He leaned into his skills as an artist, creating fantasy-themed artwork and illustrations. He even explored the world of game development, producing role-playing games that reflected his fascination with storytelling and imagination. But for every step forward, there was a wall waiting. The problem wasn't Grant's creativity. It was that the world refused to see him as anything other than the ghost hunter. His art and music drew small but loyal followings, yet nowhere near the global attention he had once commanded. The shadow of ghost hunters loomed large, and no matter how hard he tried, people still asked the same question: when are you coming back? That question became a reality in 2019 when Ghost Hunters was revived on A&E, with Grant Wilson returning as the executive producer and lead investigator. On paper, it was a second chance at glory, a return to the spotlight that fans had begged for. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The revival struggled to gain traction, facing stiff competition from other paranormal shows that had since taken over the genre. Programs like Ghost Adventures dominated the market, and the once groundbreaking style of TAPS now felt dated to younger audiences. Then came the pandemic. COVID-19 halted production, making it impossible to continue investigations in haunted locations across the country. Grant tried to reassure fans that the show wasn't canceled, only paused, but his words carried little certainty. Without regular episodes, the revival faded into obscurity almost as quickly as it began. By 2020, the same fans who had celebrated his return were once again left wondering what had gone wrong. Worse still, the revival didn't just fail to reignite his career, it highlighted how far things had fallen. Once, Ghost Hunters was the face of paranormal television on the Sci-Fi Channel. Now, it was a struggling reboot on a smaller network, plagued by low ratings and plagued by a world-changing pandemic. Grant tried to frame it as an evolution, but to many, it looked like an attempt to relive a past that could never truly be resurrected. The tragedy was clear. He had tried to move on, but the weight of Ghost Hunters always pulled him back. His creative projects outside the paranormal world were overshadowed, and his return to ghost hunting only reminded audiences that lightning doesn't always strike twice. By the early 2020s, Grant Wilson found himself trapped between two worlds, the one he had outgrown and the one he could never escape. The revival of Ghost Hunters on A&E in 2019 was supposed to be Grant Wilson's big comeback. For a brief moment, it looked like the magic might return, the familiar formula, the old excitement, the chance to reclaim the crown he once wore on the Sci-Fi Channel. But reality came crashing in fast. Ratings lagged behind expectations. Critics dismissed the show as a pale shadow of its former self, and new audiences gravitated toward edgier competitors like Ghost Adventures, which had spent years dominating the market while Wilson was absent. Even as the show pressed on, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Production was inconsistent, the chemistry wasn't the same, and the nostalgia that had carried the revival in its early episodes began to fade. Fans of the original series tuned in expecting to feel the rush they once had in 2004, but instead, they saw a quieter, more cautious version of the man who had once been the heart of TAPS. Wilson was older, less animated, and visibly worn down by the years of scrutiny and travel. What was supposed to be a rebirth began to look more like a reminder of everything that had been lost. Then, the pandemic struck. COVID-19 shut down filming, tours, and any hope of maintaining momentum. Fans flooded Wilson's social media with questions. Was the show canceled? Was it coming back? What would happen next? His answers were vague at best. "I don't know," became his refrain. He explained that production had been paused, not canceled, but there was no clear future. In interviews, his uncertainty was palpable. The man who once investigated the darkest corners of America now seemed haunted by a different kind of ghost, uncertainty itself, and that uncertainty bled into his personal identity. Without Ghost Hunters consistently on air, Wilson was caught in a strange limbo. He wasn't the star of a flagship paranormal series anymore, but he also wasn't completely detached from it. He couldn't let it go, and neither could his fans. Every public appearance, every online post brought the same question: when is Ghost Hunters coming back? He had no satisfying answer, only the same hesitations and disclaimers. The tragedy of this collapse wasn't just about a canceled show. It was about watching a man who had once stood at the peak of paranormal entertainment, now forced to explain himself again and again to an audience that refused to move on. His career had become an endless cycle of clarifications and reassurances with no conclusion in sight. The ambiguity became his prison. For nearly a decade, he had been the face of certainty, offering comfort to frightened homeowners, declaring evidence of hauntings, giving fans a sense of resolution. But now, in his own life, he was the one trapped in uncertainty, unable to give clear answers even about his own future. By 2021, the revival had essentially faded into silence. A&E quietly stepped away. No grand cancellation announcement, no official finale. It just dissolved into the fog, leaving fans confused and Wilson stuck with the burden of explaining a collapse he couldn't control. For a man who once built his identity on chasing the unknown, it was the cruelest irony imaginable. His own career was now the ghost, vanishing before his eyes. Away from the cameras, Grant Wilson's personal life told a quieter but equally tragic story. For years, fans saw him as the family man of ghost hunters. He often spoke about his wife, Rihanna, and their 3 sons. But the demands of television stardom left him with a brutal choice: commit to his family or commit to his career. For nearly a decade, he tried to do both, and in the end, he did neither fully. When he stepped away from the Sci-Fi Channel in 2012, he told the world it was to spend more time with his family. That explanation gave comfort to fans, but in reality, the shift wasn't as simple as closing the door on fame and returning to a quiet home life. Years of absence had already carved scars, birthdays missed, milestones unseen, and a marriage that had weathered constant separations. Coming back into that world wasn't easy. The man who left Ghost Hunters wasn't the same man who had started it, and his family had grown used to life without him always being there. Adding to this were the struggles of identity. Without Ghost Hunters, who was Grant Wilson? He was a musician, yes, and an artist, and a game designer. But none of these titles carried the weight of Ghost Hunter. Fans didn't line up around the block to see his artwork. They didn't buy out conventions for his music. Those projects became side notes in a life still defined by one thing he could never fully escape. He was trapped in a cycle where any attempt to reinvent himself was overshadowed by the ghost of his past fame. Financially, things weren't stable either. Without the steady paycheck from the Sci-Fi Channel, Wilson turned to smaller ventures, personal appearances, merchandise, tours, and collaboration. He still had a fan base, but it wasn't enough to sustain the level of life he once had. Unlike Hollywood celebrities, paranormal stars don't walk away with millions in syndication royalties. For many, the fame is fleeting, and when the spotlight fades, the bills still come due. The whispers of financial struggles began to surface in fan circles, and though Wilson himself never confirmed them, the reality was clear. The man who once fronted one of the most successful paranormal shows in history was now fighting to maintain stability in an industry that had moved on without him. And then there was the emotional toll. Wilson had spent years on screen comforting terrified families, telling them they weren't alone. But in his own life, the roles were reversed. He was the one haunted by isolation, by the sense that no matter what he did, he could never recapture what he had lost. The revival on A&E proved it wasn't just nostalgia, it was desperation. A man trying to grab hold of the identity that had slipped through his fingers. And when that collapsed, he was left adrift once more. By 2025, Wilson's life had become a tragic reminder of what happens when fame is tied to a single identity. He had tried to be more than the ghost hunter, but the world never let him. Fans still demanded answers about ghost hunters, critics still mocked his investigations, and his creative pursuits were swallowed whole by the legacy of TAPS. The man who once walked boldly into the darkness now found himself lost in a different kind of haunting, one made not of spirits, but of memories, regrets, and the heavy weight of what could have been. By the time the A&E revival collapsed, Grant Wilson's place in the public eye had changed dramatically. Once celebrated as the empathetic face of ghost hunters on the Sci-Fi Channel, he was now remembered more for what had been lost than for what he had accomplished. Longtime fans still spoke of him fondly, calling him the heart of TAPS, but many admitted that the revival had revealed a different man, older, tired, and caught between trying to live up to his past while struggling to carve out a future. Nostalgia kept his name alive, but it also froze him in time, preventing him from moving on. Younger fans of the paranormal scene barely knew who he was, focusing instead on louder, flashier shows that had taken over the genre. The critics were harsher. Online skeptics ridiculed him as the man who overreacted to creaks and whispers in old buildings, using memes and threads to tear down the credibility he once fought so hard to maintain. For them, his revival wasn't a comeback, but a reminder that his era had ended long ago. Meanwhile, even at conventions or fan gatherings, the questions he faced told the same story. People didn't want to hear about his music, his artwork, or his creative ventures. They wanted to know if ghost hunters would ever return, as though his identity was locked permanently in 2004. His reputation had become its own haunting, one he couldn't escape, no matter how many new paths he tried to walk. Now, in 2025, Wilson's life is quieter, smaller, and far more fragile than the fame he once enjoyed. He remains active on social media, selling artwork, releasing music, and appearing at smaller paranormal events, but his reach has shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. The man who once traveled the country with production crews and primetime contracts now organizes modest tours and fan meetups that barely register in mainstream culture. The ambiguity of ghost hunters still lingers. He avoids clear answers about its future, often telling fans he simply doesn't know. That uncertainty has become the defining trait of his later years, a symbol of a man stuck between what once was and what will likely never be again.